let me welcome everyone to this event, our Publius Symposium. The Constitutional Law Center every year honors an important new book, usually from the preceding year in the field of constitutional law, and invite the author to make a presentation about the book and several commentators to comment. So this year, the book is by our speaker, whom I'm also going to introduce, and thank you for being here. Jacob Mchangama is a Danish lawyer who founded an organization called, is it pronounced Justitia or Justitia? Either one. Okay, so Justitia, which is primarily engaged in the defense of free speech around the world. He has recently moved to the United States and is now a research professor at Vanderbilt University, but has brought his organization with him. So he is now, his center of operations are now Nashville. But he has written this just marvelous book, which is both highly informative. I thought I knew a lot about the history of freedom of speech in the world, but almost every page I learned something else. So this is an extremely deeply researched, interesting, and just a joy to read. So you should really pick it up and appreciate it. So in any event, this is the book, and then I am so proud of the panelists here tonight. This is probably as distinguished a group of free speech experts as could possibly have been put together, and they're also friends, so isn't that nice? So first, beginning with Eugene Volokh, who has been a professor of law teaching free speech law. He has a clinic at UCLA. He has a clinic that produces amicus briefs in free speech cases. He is both, I would say, one of the nation's leading, if not the leading, expert on the intricacies of free speech and press doctrine, but also one of the nation's leading experts on the social media world and the internet. He was writing about the internet and its legal implications when I didn't even know what the internet was. So, and the really nice thing, and this you should really plan to applaud what I'm about to say, is that Eugene is moving here to Stanford this summer and will be leaving at UCLA and be a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, where I expect that he is going to be heavily engaged in the life of the law school as well. So that makes me very happy and should make you happy too. On his right is Robert Post, and Robert has so many experiences and accolades. I can't begin to name them, but he's probably best known for having been the dean for how many years? For 8 years at I forget the name of it, but it's a law school in central Connecticut. Some people may have heard of it. Named, I think, after a lock manufacturer, unlike one that's named after a railroad robber baron. But Robert has been a leading scholar in the First Amendment field forever. But his most recent book, just completed but not yet out on the book stands, is the Holmes devised history of the Taft period in the Supreme Court. So Robert is not just a First Amendment doctrinal authority, but also a serious historian, and thus, perfect for a book about the history of free speech in the world. And last but not least, my good friend Julie Owono. She and I served together as members of the Meta Oversight Board, and so we're in constant communication, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in disagreement. So Julie is also the head of an important free speech organization designed especially to work for access for for perhaps less powerful people, vulnerable populations around the world, access to the internet, and it's called Internet sans. I don't speak French. Internet sans frontières, right? Julie is from Cameroon originally, a citizen of France. Grew up for 5 years in Russia. 10 years she lived as a child in Russia because of her father being the ambassador. She speaks I don't know how many languages and is now present in Stanford, I think she's just moved up to Sonoma County, which I would do too if I could. So in any event, please welcome. First, Jacob is going to talk about the book, and then without any further introduction from me, we'll hear from each of the commentators.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be here. Also a little bit intimidating given the eminence of the commentators assembled here today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I also want to thank Morgan Weiland for giving me the opportunity to speak to a lot of really brilliant students earlier today. As Michael said, I moved to the US around a year ago. And one thing that has struck me is what I would call a mood of free speech pessimism, both in the media, in civil society, and academia, including among some First Amendment scholars. These are groups of highly intelligent, opinionated, and intelligent people who depend on free speech for their livelihoods and have also been instrumental in shaping the legal standards of today, often in face of resistance and sometimes even persecution. So perhaps naively, I imagined that these demographics would be broadly united by a robust civil libertarian commitment to core tenets of First Amendment doctrines. Instead, it seemed to me that many free speech pessimists have concluded that American free speech exceptionalism is at best naive or even dangerously misguided. Many now believe that free speech has strayed from its original noble role, what Frederick Douglass called the great moral renovator of society and government, and instead been weaponized, in a popular term, against democracies, minorities, and truth. And frequently, free speech pessimists combine criticism or even contempt for the cultish devotion to the First Amendment with envious praise of how other mature democracies balance free speech with competing societal needs. European democracies, in particular, are viewed with admiration as the responsible adults in the room, set on fire by a dysfunctional Congress and a Supreme Court blinded by American exceptionalism. By contrast, Europe has taken proactive steps to shield democracy from the deluge of hate speech and disinformation, of unchecked free speechism in our disruptive digital age. And I think that in many ways, this is a seductive and compelling story. Who can look at the world of the past decade or so and claim that free speech does not entail serious risk and harms? Who can deny that the dark sides of free speech have been amplified? And so if the basic premises of free speech have been fundamentally changed, it seems logical to probe the very concept itself, lest this freedom become the great moral degenerator. And of course, the First Amendment should not be treated like an article of faith, unquestionably accepted like the very doctrines of revealed religion, which free speech played such a prominent role in probing, in opening up to skeptical reasoning. But it does not necessarily follow that the harms of free speech can be remedied by restricting this freedom. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. So we have to ask an important question. Would America be a more cohesive, tolerant, free, and just democracy if the First Amendment was Europeanized? In my book, I argue that history suggests otherwise. But today, I'm going to stray from your plan, Michael, and not talk so much about the book and history. Instead, I want to look into the future. So follow me in a parallel universe. Imagine it's 2025. 2 demonstrators burn an effigy of the newly inaugurated President Trump, which reads, "Put down the dictator." They're quickly arrested and convicted for threats against the president. A probably absurd scenario in the US, but it happened just last month in my home country of Denmark. In 2021, a number of protesters under a lockdown protest burned an effigy of the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen with a sign which called in some terms for her death, and these were initially arrested for high treason and put in prison on remand, and then charged with threats. They were acquitted in the first instance, but convicted by the High Court and sentenced to 40 days in prison. Or let's say a Republican-dominated Congress passes a set of laws to strengthen the respect of Republican values in the US. These laws permit the federal government to designate and ban extremist groups by decree. Immediately, Antifa and other leftist groups are banned, and several members arrested. Leftist bloggers, activists, and artists are convicted of glorifying extremism. It just so happens that in 2021, France passed such a law of respecting Republican principles. Initially, it was targeted at radical Islamic groups, but it was quickly applied to ban more than 30 groups by decree, ranging from far-right groups even to environmentalist organizations. In Spain that same year, a rapper called Pablo Hasél was sentenced to 9 months in prison for glorifying terrorism and fined for attacking the Spanish monarchy and police in rap lyrics and tweets. When Pablo Hasél took his case before the European Court of Human Rights, it rejected his complaint as manifestly ill-founded. Now, a Biden administration might also favor a balanced approach to free speech. Instead of the federal government having to send passive-aggressive letters to big tech, imagine that Congress could pass a law that allowed the Attorney General to ask courts to block online disinformation, and maybe also to ban state-sponsored media outlets and block Americans from access to these media outlets. Of course, this isn't a theoretical scenario either. In 2018, France adopted a law to combat the manipulation of information, empowering courts to block false or misleading statements during election periods. In 2022, the European Union banned RT and Sputnik from broadcasting and mandated that social media companies and search engine stop users from sharing broadcasts from these outlets in all 27 member states. An increasing number of young Americans view free speech as being in tension with equality, as being weaponized against minorities. And that, I think, is also true here in California, where several laws have been passed or proposed to counter hatred on and offline. These laws have been limited in scope, but with some rethinking of the legal framework around free speech, California could add real teeth to these laws. Platforms could be legally accountable for user-generated hate speech. A political majority in Sacramento could ensure that Californians with views on race, immigration, gender equality, and religion deemed offensive, insulting, or hateful are prosecuted, or even hold prominent social media users accountable for postings by their followers. Again, this is not some far-fetched dystopia. The German NetzDG law from 2017 ordered social networks to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or face fines of up to 50 million euros. Predictably, the postings of a satirical magazine was one of the first casualties of the law. But Germany's fight against illegal online speech is not limited to big tech. So in 2021, a man in Hamburg called a local politician who had violated COVID rules that he himself had voted for a dick on Twitter. 3 months later, at 6 a.m. in the morning, police officers arrived at his house looking to seize his devices. Now, dawn raids of suspected internet trolls has become official policy. The head of Germany's Federal Crime Office recently warned, anyone who posts hate messages must expect the police to be at the front door. And as of 2022, there were over 8,000 criminal investigations and 1,000 charges for illegal online speech in Germany. France has taken it a step further. A local far-right politician was fined for hate speech for failing to remove Islamophobic comments by users on his Facebook account. That decision was also upheld by the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights in 2023. Many of you will have heard about the European Union's Digital Services Act, which is sometimes labeled the global gold standard for platform regulation. And it promises a rules-based order in the so-called digital Wild West. And on the one hand, the DSA includes much-needed transparency and user rights, but it also mandates platforms to act decisively against illegal content. And as we have seen, this covers very broad categories of speech. I haven't even mentioned criminal defamation and blasphemy, which is also enforced in several European states. And under the DSA, the European Commission, a political body, acts as a key regulator with powers to issue fines of up to 6% of global turnover. So far, there are indications that could make you fear that the Commission may politicize the enforcement of the DSA. So when riots broke out in France after a North African teen was killed by the police, EU Commissioner and top digital enforcer Thierry Breton warned that under the DSA, quote, when there's hateful content that calls for revolt and social media companies don't act immediately, then we'll be able to ban their operations on our territory. In other words, a blanket ban. This might be political posturing that won't hold up in court, but French President Macron and his digital minister have said much the same. All of this demonstrates a European unease about free speech in a digital age and a willingness to use increasingly illiberal means to impose some kind of top-down control. Now, to be fair, I'm the anomaly. Most Europeans don't seem to view this free speech recession as a problem, unless they end up on the wrong side of censorship themselves, as happened just this month when police banned conferences of pro-Palestinian leftists in Berlin and temporarily a right-wing nationalist conservative in Brussels. But what about America? Would a similar legal framework truly reduce rather than exacerbate the polarization in a country as diverse as America when it comes to geography, culture, politics, religion, and ethnicity? Taking into account that this country was founded upon an ingrained distrust of government that sets it apart from the dirigiste tradition of France, the militant democracy of Germany, and the high-trust, homogenous countries of Scandinavia. Looking at the history of this country, is it not more likely that a Europeanization of the First Amendment would lead to a future that may not repeat, but perhaps rhymes with what happened during the Sedition Act in 1798 and the Red Scares of the 20th century? Remember that many brilliant minds, Alexander Hamilton, Woodrow Wilson, and Robert H. Jackson, to name a few, deemed these laws necessary by the exigencies of the day. But today, they're almost universally condemned as the archetypical forms of suppression that the First Amendment was supposed to prevent. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not arguing that free speech will automatically save democracy, or that the best ideas will win out in the marketplace of ideas, or that good speech will automatically drive out bad speech. Free speech is still an experiment, and no one can guarantee the outcome. But as I hope my book will have showed, history at least suggests that the experiment is a noble one. For all its flaws, a world with less free speech will also be less tolerant, democratic, enlightened, innovative, and free. Free speech often seems like an abstract and theoretical principle when confronted with concrete harms. But it is a hard-won principle based on millennia of practical and often bloody experience with the consequences of its suppression. In truth, for the pessimist, I think that a robust and principled commitment to free speech may well be the best hope for averting disaster. Or in the words of Joni Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much to Morgan for the invitation and to Jacob for this extremely timely and I think important introduction to set us for the important debate we're going to have tonight. I prepared a few remarks based on your book, but I think it's the beauty of the book you wrote, I think, is that precisely because it chooses to always go back to what happened, to the history, allows us to have an object book that is so dynamic and so adaptable to even current days. For those who have read the book, if you look at I have a picture here of the table of content. There is one particular chapter, which is called the free speech procession. You rightly referred to it in your introductory remarks. You wrote this book, I think, in 2022, and we had no idea that 2 years later we would be in an important historic moment in which we are all, including in the United States, because of events in the Middle East, asking ourselves about the state of freedom of expression, or First Amendment free speech in the US, but I would say more globally in the world. Before I get into specific details, I really want to express how much I appreciated reading Jacob's book. The historical perspective to me is extremely important because not only does it allow us to reflect on what did our forefathers do or think when faced with this very same situation as we're facing it right now, but also it allows to understand that free speech, and more generally the concept of democracy, is a contribution of humanity. It was indeed, the concept was indeed first materialized in its modern form in Greece, but then reading Jacob's book, you very soon realize that there have been various influences, including Islamic influences, which at a certain time in history, were more open and more open to change than Christian traditions. And probably one aspect on which I will disagree with Jacob, and that hence my response, is that I feel that history is probably incomplete. I will explain why. As Michael rightly said in the introduction, I'm Cameroonian, I come from Africa, and I've always wondered, especially having grown up in Western societies almost all my life, I've always wondered about the contributions of Africans to the beautiful ideas of democracy and of freedoms that I learned about when I was studying at La Sorbonne in Paris. And while reading Jacob's book, I had the sense that the history was not complete. Why? Because, and that's a question to you, Jacob, I hope you'll have the time to answer. Numerous studies and testimonies from Greeks, including in the 4th century, have alluded to the relationship that existed between antique Greece and antique Egypt. And that's very precisely where I want to interrogate Jacob's reading of that history, and specifically ask to what extent ancient Egypt might have also brought a contribution to the Greeks' construction of the modern concept of democracy as we know it today. And I'm asking it because based on recent research have tried to understand how the Egyptians, for instance, understood freedom, but not by referring directly to freedom, but rather by studying the place and the rights granted to individuals in Egypt, and specifically by focusing on whether or not the concept of slavery existed, which is a total opposition to the concept of freedom. And in that regard, I would very much like Jacob's enlightenment here, if there is a debate on that. I think there is, at least in the sources that I read, mostly in French, because I sadly can't read ancient Egypt yet in English. Yes, I'm very interested in that, in understanding the contributions that might have come from different parts of the world. The second remark that I wanted to share, and maybe an important lesson, another very important lesson from Jacob's book is the very accurate prediction, really, of the moment where we are right now. I started by referring to that. The free speech recession is absolutely reality. There are debates every day about campus freedom of speech. I was walking by and did see some protest or attempts to protest. I don't know what's Stanford's position on protesting about the war in Gaza. But, and what is very, I almost want to say frightening, is that coming from, I will be very frank, and Michael knows that I'm a very frank person, coming from what is considered by many as a banana republic, quite frankly, where a government is abusing its own constitution and abusing the rights, fundamental rights of its citizens. We always have this vision that Western modern societies are immune to the dangers of recession of democracy and recession of rights. And I have to say, having lived in France and also having spent a few years now also in the United States, I am extremely concerned. And I am even more concerned because, as Michael was referring to it, my interest is to fight for the right to access to information and to access to that information online. The internet being today, whether we agree or not, the very last frontier for freedom of expression, in my opinion, and freedom to access information. So when we have governments, Western governments, adopting laws that say, well, actually, that last frontier for freedoms, we probably should, control it a little bit more. I'm also very concerned by the fact that a nation like the United States that has, for years, 30 years, for decades now, painted this image of global internet freedom, suddenly trampling with its own vision by suggesting through the Congress and potentially through a signing of a bill by President Biden, by suggesting that the United States could ban, access to citizens to an important platform of expression that is used by, I think, more than 150 million Americans. So I am very, very concerned by the moment in which we are. We all thought that we could find answers in the oldest and probably most stable democracies that have ever existed, maybe. And it's probably not the case, and that is extremely frightening. But I will turn to the future, and I appreciated your openness in your speech. And provocatively, and I would like to get your thought on that, Jacob, I want to think that maybe some of the answers will come precisely from the people and precisely from the countries where the very concept of freedom has not existed for a long time, and where the thirst for freedom is so strong that individuals, organizations get even more creative to try to protect it. Probably one reflection that I've had in that regard is related to a very recent example. A country located in West Africa, in Senegal, a country bordering, okay, I don't want to expose myself. Okay, Gambia for sure. I'm really terrible at, sorry, I'll stop there. But Senegal has just elected its new president. It's a very young president who 3 weeks before he was elected was in jail. He was not in jail because he has committed a crime. He was in jail because he was an opponent to the former president who wanted to attempt to violate the Constitution and to run again, or at least manipulate the elections in his favor, or in favor of his political party. That young man was elected against all odds, precisely because of the internet, precisely because people had so much thirst for freedoms and did not want to backslide to authoritarianism in Senegal, and also because the population is extremely young. We have to remember the African continent is one of the youngest in the world, and I think we can agree here, especially in this, on this campus, there's nothing that can resist to the will of a young mind. And the example of Senegal is particularly striking because people had access to internet, despite the fact that the government attempted to shut it down, because they were able to share the stories about what was happening in their country through Instagram, through TikTok, through Facebook, through many other platforms. Because of that, the government was obliged, and the Constitutional Court was obliged to tell the president, stop, we will not do this in this country. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to share a few remarks and questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Megan. It's a great honor to be here today to celebrate Jacob's wonderful book. You all should buy it, and you all should read it. Like Michael, I learned something on every page. It's elegant, and it's sweeping, and it's a page turner. It's beautifully written, and it's a wonderful tribute to freedom of speech, which, as Jacob and Julie have just mentioned, is undergoing at the present time a crisis throughout the world. The book tells the entire sweep of the history. It starts with Athens and with freedom of speech in the assembly, in the agora. In Athens, it tells the story of the loss of freedom of speech from afterwards in the Middle Ages, and then its slow recreation after the Enlightenment, culminating, of course, in the First Amendment and in the North American continent, where it's been freer than, I would say, any place else, for the most part, as a matter of law. So when you paint a panorama of that scope, you, of course, have to paint with a very broad brush. And when one wants to think of the implications, as you heard today, for contemporary problems of the First Amendment, sometimes a broad brush isn't the best way to approach the problem. So I'm a mere lawyer, and if I do any history, it's only of America, 20th century America. So I can't mimic the scope, but what I'll try to do is focus more precisely on the implications of the grand story that Jacob tells. And the interesting thing to me is that the book is framed as a history of free speech. But if you actually look at the book and at the stories you tell, it's not about speech per se. It's not about people talking to their lawyers. It's not about product safety warnings, which is the form of speech. It's rather people getting together in a political context, trying to form public opinion, and trying to make the state responsive to them. That's the story repeatedly told by Jacob. When we talk about freedom of speech, that's the kind of speech we're focusing on. That's not speech itself. That's a particular kind of speech. That's the speech which is necessary for democracy. And so the way I read Jacob's book is it's really a history of the coming of age of democracy, contemporary democracy, and the way in which democracy requires, of its own accord, freedom of speech. In Australia, they don't have a Bill of Rights, but they understand that freedom of speech is necessary for the democracy, which they do have in their constitution, and that, I think, would be true anywhere. So what sort of speech is necessary for democracy? Why does democracy, of all forms of government, depend upon speech? Well, democracy rests on the value of self-determination, self-governance. We govern ourselves, but how do we govern ourselves? If I vote in the election and I lose, how am I governing myself? If I keep losing, how do I govern myself? If I'm a Republican in California, how are you governing yourself? It's a tough, it's not an obvious proposition. And the way in which it's managed is, if you're in California and if you're a Republican, you think you might win the next election. That's why you keep participating in elections. And why do you think you might win the next election? Because you talk to the electorate. You participate in the formation of public opinion here. And we want the state to be responsive to public opinion. Indeed, we could define, and many theorists have defined, democracy as that form of government which is responsive to public opinion. That's the meaning of democracy. So democracy comes about when certain forms of communication become possible. There was a public in ancient Greece, where Jacob begins his book, but the public was confined to those people who could hear the sound of a human voice in the agora. That was the public. That was a public assembly. The meaning of the word public changes with the invention of printing in the 15th century, and it changes totally with the invention of newspapers and magazines in the 18th century, because what that did is it created a group of people who were reading the same magazines. And it created a group of people who were exposed to the same communication in a scope and in dimensions that far exceed the agora, far exceed any human being. It went as far as a newspaper could circulate, as far as a book could be handed from person to person to person. And it created what we now call the public sphere. This was the consequence of the invention of printing. And the public sphere created something called a public, which has a public opinion. So democracy wasn't possible, wasn't conceptually possible at the scale of the nation state until the creation of the public sphere and the creation of our notion of the public. Remember, when we speak about the public, we say the public wants to know, the public is curious, the public is outraged. We anthropomorphize the public, but the public is, as the media scholar Michael Schertzen said, the fiction that makes democracy possible. So when we speak about freedom of speech, and when I see the stories in Jacob's book, it's all about the formation, the kinds of communication that are necessary for the public sphere, that are necessary to form the public opinion at the scale of the nation state and make the state responsive to the public. That's the story that's being told. To my mind, I have to be very careful and discriminating here. That's not a story of speech. That's a story of democracy and the communications required by democracy. That's a subset of speech. And with regard to that subset of speech, we have very particular rules in the United States which we identify with the idea of freedom of speech. So we say no content discrimination. The state can't tell you what to talk about. No viewpoint discrimination. The state can't tell you what side to take. And why is that? Because we want the state to be responsive to public opinion. We want public opinion setting the agenda for the state and not the reverse. We say no compelled speech. Why is that? Because we don't want the state creating the sources of its own legitimacy. We legitimate the state. The state doesn't legitimate us by compelling to speak. We say no prior restraints. Why? Because we don't want the state truncating the creation of public opinion, and so forth and so on. All these extraordinarily sharp and important and strict rules which define freedom of speech are really about the relationship of the state to the formation of public opinion. Now, that's a slightly different story than the one that is framed as a history of freedom of speech. And if I have a comment about the book, it's that it tends to bleed over from the communications necessary to form public opinion to speech itself, speech qua speech. So let me give you two examples of that. One example of that is when you talk about FIRE. FIRE is something called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and you cite its indictment, and I'm quoting now, that more than a fifth of the 478 US colleges and universities surveyed in 2020 had at least one policy that both clearly and substantially restricts freedom of speech. So this is saying colleges and universities don't have freedom of speech. Well, let's think about freedom of speech at a college. Let's think about a classroom. I teach in the classroom. Is there content restriction in my classroom? You bet there is. If I'm teaching First Amendment, they don't get to talk about March Madness. Is there content restriction on me? You bet there is. I'm teaching First Amendment. I don't get to talk about my favorite baseball team. Is there prior restraints? You bet. They don't get to talk unless they raise their hand, and I recognize them. Is there viewpoint discrimination? You bet there is. That's called grades. Is there compelled speech? Yes, there is. We call that examinations. Speak, or I can't give you a grade, right? We govern speech in universities in ways which are totally inconsistent with freedom of speech. We do that for professors, and we do that for students. So it's not the same freedom of speech. In fact, it's academic freedom. It's a different kind of freedom. It's oriented around the mission of education. We require freedom and deep forms of freedom in the university, but you can't conflate that freedom with the freedom of public opinion. University is not a park. It's not Hyde Park. And you can't just stand up and have a right to speak at a university. We govern the speech by communication, but these nuances are missed if one just has the general idea of freedom of speech, because of course it's speech in the classroom. Let me give you a second example of where this happens. A really wonderful theme in Jacob's book is a distinction between freedom of speech bottom up and freedom of speech tops down. So the distinction now, I'll quote the book, between Athens' egalitarian free speech ideals of Isagoria, is that how you pronounce it? And Parrhesia, is that how you pronounce it? Parrhesia, right, on the one hand. So in Athens, everyone could speak bottom up. Every person could speak. It wasn't just the elite. Versus Rome, and in Jacob's words, Rome's elitist free speech ideal included in libertas. So we have free speech bottom up, and in Rome, the elite get to speak, but the hoi polloi don't get to speak. They have to be represented. So top down, bottom up freedom of speech. And that's a really profound and useful distinction in understanding the history of freedom of speech throughout the world. And I think it's fair to say, tell me if I'm wrong, that Jacob is on the side of Parrhesia. So he writes, and I'm quoting him, media outlets and experts must find new and innovative ways to earn the trust of a public that is no longer a passive recipient of hierarchical top-down knowledge production and filtering, jealously guarding the crumbling pillars of privileged access to the public sphere is unlikely to provide a winning strategy amidst deep distrust of elites in general and the established media in particular. That's Jacob, and you can see why it's such a wonderful book. Eloquent sentence, precisely stated, and there's something absolutely plainly right about it. But I want to say there's something absolutely wrong about it too. And that would be something like this. If you wanted to know whether, say, nicotine causes cancer, would you depend upon libertas or would you depend upon Parrhesia? Would you go to the internet and Instagram to see if nicotine caused cancer? If you want to know whether there was climate change, would you expect Parrhesia? Would you want it bottom up? Or would you want it top down? So it turns out there is things that we want bottom up. Public opinion has to be bottom up. Why is that? Because every human being who is governed has a right to participate in their government and in the formation of public policy. Call that democratic equality. But if we want to know something, the truth of something, it might not be a very good way to find out whether it's true or not. Thomas Kuhn's, the great theorist of scientific revolution, said the one rule that we have in science is we don't settle a scientific question by taking a vote. That's not the way to know whether the atom has an electron, you know, there's a proton or an electron, or how many neutrons there are in helium. You don't do that by voting. You do that by discussion among those qualified to participate in the discussion. They have to be free to talk to each other, but only certain people are qualified to contribute to it, unless, of course, you know, you don't have the PhD, but you know enough that people who are competent deem you to be competent. But bottom up is not the way science works. And we wouldn't want it to work that way, because then, you know, for all we would know, a COVID vaccine would make your bones glow in the dark. And that might win the popular election. That doesn't make it true. So there are forms of speech where we do not want Parrhesia, where we want libertas. And it's equally speech, but it's oriented toward a different task. One is knowledge, and the other is public opinion. Public opinion must be democratic, bottom up. Knowledge is a slightly different proposition. So that's, again, a distinction between kinds and domains of communication. One has to be very clear how these prescriptions work. And the bottom line of all of this, of course, is that if we're beginning to think about how we're going to protect speech in a world in which we are facing new and, I would say, deeply untheorized challenges like the internet. We've seen some discussion of the internet today. We have to be really crisp and really clear about the kind of speech that's at issue. All speech isn't the same as every other speech. There's different kinds, and we need to think carefully about the pluses and the minuses of talking about which kind of speech is at issue when we take the lessons of this magnificent history that Jacob has given us, gifted us, really, in his book.
I want to highly recommend Jacob's book. It's a great read. I also learned a great deal from it, and anybody who's really interested in free speech ought to be reading it. I wanted to particularly praise two items in it. One is a specific but very important point. One thing that the book reminds us, or even educates us more broadly about, is how commonly restrictions that are aimed at suppressing certain views are framed as restrictions on fake news or disinformation. And conversely, how often restrictions that might be seen, at least by some, as aimed at genuinely suppressing false statements of fact, end up suppressing opinions that those in power dislike. This is familiar to students of American history from the history of the Sedition Act of 1798, which was in fact billed as what today would be called a law about fake news. It supposedly targeted only false statements, and malicious ones at that, rather than just innocent mistakes. But it quite promptly, and totally unsurprisingly, was used to suppress opinions, what today would be clearly understood to be opinions. What I didn't really realize is how commonly that was used as a justification for restricting speech in a vast range of other places and times. And that indeed, a great many restrictions, both imposed by totalitarian countries where you could say, well, what do we care what they label them? They're just going to label it whatever to try to suppress it. But also by countries that have some democratic qualities, but that maybe are retreating from them or struggling towards them and not quite reaching them. The sense, well, of course we need to be able to restrict fake news and disinformation, and then all sorts of stuff gets punished in the name of that, including what today we would recognize is either accurate or just opinion. So I think that's a tremendously important point. A second thing, and here I want to disagree with Robert in some measure, that I liked about the book is precisely that it talked not just about political speech, and not just political speech within democracies, or Rome was never really a democracy in that for a variety of reasons, but it was an attempt at popular government, albeit by a particular set of people in a particular, really malapportioned set, even among those who had the vote. But setting that aside, these issues came up within non-democratic countries, and often were precisely not political speech. There were religious speech, and they were about scientific speech. And I take it the objection to the silencing of Galileo, among others, and Galileo got off light, with regard to the heliocentric heliocentric theory of the solar system, is not that it interfered with democracy or with political, not that it interfered with political life. Maybe indirectly it might have, because it might have undermined the role of the church, and therefore undermined the role of the church in the state, and therefore undermined the way the state was run. But that's not the real problem there. Nor is the problem that it interfered with democracy, because Robert is of course quite right that we don't vote, or at least we shouldn't vote on these kinds of questions. It interfered with speech. It interfered with communication of ideas. Maybe not every single form of speech. Jacob hasn't talked much about child pornography bans, or even obscenity law. Of course, obscenity law in many situations did interfere with various kinds of ideas, but with regard to what today would be viewed as hardcore pornography, maybe it ought to be constitutionally protected, but the book doesn't really focus on that. And for good reason. It's about ideas, and it's about facts, and it's about changing people's minds, but changing people's minds is important far outside the context of political life, purely political life, and far outside the context of democracy. The book didn't talk much about it, but in many hierarchical institutions, including the military, certain kinds of free speech are actually seen as very important because, not for democratic reasons, but because the people at the top of the hierarchy really need to know certain information. And many countries have been led to ruin precisely because the leader, many authoritarian countries, precisely because the authorities had suppressed too much speech in a way that they lacked information, or they were losing a war, or they were doing something that would lose them the war and such. So I think those are very valuable features of the book. With regard to Robert's points about the classroom analogy and scientific expertise, I don't think that's at all incompatible with some of the discussions of speech writ large. So it's true in the classroom we don't have free speech as it's generally understood. But it is, as Robert has in his other work pointed out, in part because it's a managerial domain where the goal is to accomplish certain results. It's not because it plays no role in public discourse. It's not because there's not political speech, certainly it's not scientific speech going on there. It's because we need to have mechanisms to actually get certain things done, including the communication of certain kinds of information and knowledge and habits of mind and skills and techniques, that even when they do touch very much on political life, as, say, teaching in a law school does, we have to impose certain restrictions. And in the very same institution, outside of the building, the very same students may, in fact, have very broad free speech rights. So those are all, I think, tremendously useful things. I wanted, though, to ask you, Jacob, about two things you didn't much talk about. Look, any history book always has to exclude orders of magnitude more than it includes, just to be manageable. But they had to do with one kind of restriction that most democracies accept, with little controversy about having it, although some controversy about implementing it, and that is libel law. And I don't mean seditious libel or some of the other blasphemous libel or obscene libel, which today would just be called blasphemy and obscenity, but basically false statements of fact, if one can distinguish statements of fact from opinion, and the law presupposes you can, about people that damage their reputations and therefore might really seriously damage their lives, their professional and personal lives. And sometimes it may be just purely private matters, like accusing someone of having cheated on their spouse or lover. But often it is libel lawsuits brought by government officials or other political influencers. Let's set aside the name public figure. Let's talk about political influencers. They could be journalists, could be professors and others. But also sometimes ordinary people caught up as illustrations of important ideas or important issues in the news. There's some incident, some people claim it is a good illustration of racism, or some claim it's a good illustration of anti-Semitism. And the person who's being accused says, no, you got it wrong. And now you are damaging my employment prospects, damaging my friendships, because you've said these false things about it. It's not purely personal, because it was about an incident that's in the news, but it's damaging me as an individual. So there are obvious ways in which this can be abused and has been abused. That's part of the reason why the Supreme Court has cut down on it in cases like New York Times v. Sullivan. But 3 justices in New York Times v. Sullivan would have completely abolished libel law, at least as to statements and matters of public concern about public officials. And their logic would probably apply to statements and matters of public concern even more broadly. But the majority, including Justice Brennan, who wrote the majority opinion, didn't accept that. So one question I wanted to ask you is, what does your sense of this history tell us about these kinds of libel laws? And by the way, people are now deliberately deploying them to fight what they think is misinformation that is harmful to the public. Their motivation is protecting democracy, but they're using the tool that is available. In America, we don't have fake news bans, but we do have libel laws. And one other thing that I've been seeing is there's survival and revival of criminal libel as a remedy. Because part of the problem with civil remedies is they really don't work unless either the plaintiff or the defendant is rich. If the plaintiff is rich, the plaintiff can say, I'll spend the money to get vindication through this verdict. If the defendant is rich, maybe some lawyer will take the case on contingency. But if the plaintiff and defendant are both not rich, libel law is pointless. And the only way it gets enforced is either through criminal libel laws, a few of which exist in America, still in about 10 states, or civil libel laws that lead to injunctions, which are basically enforced through the threat of criminal remedies, which about 2/3 of the states allow injunctions in libel cases. Or in California, there's a different statute that says nothing about libel as such. That's not being reinvented by prosecutors who feel the need for this remedy, even though criminal libel law has been abolished. So I wanted to know what you think about civil libel law and criminal libel law, about both as invoked with regard to high-level politicians, but also with regard to ordinary people. And the last thing I want to ask about is personal criticism. You hear these sometimes it's labeled harassment, although that's a highly ill-defined term. Sometimes people talk about it as bullying, another ill-defined term. Sometimes they even call it doxing, which sometimes means publishing people's personal information, like their bank account numbers, social security numbers, or even addresses, let's say. But sometimes when people say doxing, they just mean identifying a person as the one who is involved in some incident. And sometimes there are all of these online campaigns of vilification targeting a person that aren't libelous in that they don't actually make a false statement. They just express really harsh opinions. And a lot of people are really bothered about it. And I've seen things which I think under First Amendment law, this kind of criticism is protected. But I've seen like injunctions where the judge says the defendant shall stop saying anything whatever about the plaintiff. Because the judge thinks the defendant is bullying, harassing, vilifying the plaintiff, and it's got to stop. So libel law I'm kind of on board with. These kinds of laws I'm not on board with. But Jacob, I want to know what you think, how you think they fit into this bigger picture. Are they the same kinds of dangers or comparable dangers to what you're talking about? Or is there something to the notion that a free society, a democratic society, a speech-protective society can have these kinds of restrictions and still have free speech pretty broadly survive in order to shield individuals from possible harms?
Lot to take in. Thanks. Julie, I want to start with you. In terms of Africa, I don't know. I would be very interested in learning more about the evidence I mean, it's obvious that there's a very important link between ancient Greece and Egypt in terms of culture, science, and so on. I don't know. I haven't stumbled upon it in terms of free speech, and the history of ancient Egypt is very, very long, and I'm certainly not an expert on it. But it seems to me that in the pharaonic eras, free speech would have been a counterintuitive ideal to someone which, at least in certain periods, was seen as a divine person themselves. And I think I mentioned in the book certain inscriptions that we've been found that sort of indicates that there was a very hierarchical nature in which you were not supposed to speak ill of your betters, and you were supposed to conform. So when I have included something from Africa, it's typically modern day. So I think apartheid South Africa is a very strong case for why free speech matters. It's censorship and suppression in apartheid South Africa was incredibly harsh and sophisticated. So everything from having an index of censorship to having basically hate speech laws that protected the white man, as it was called. And Mandela, I think, is very inspirational in two moments. So one is when he's been put on trial for sabotage and terrorism. He basically explains the process of why he decided to use physical violence. And he basically explains, for a very long time, the ANC did not use physical violence because they wanted to, they didn't believe in it. They believed in nonviolence, but progressively, the apartheid regime escalated the suppression to the point where it was no longer possible to criticize or speak out. And only then did they find it justified to use violence. And then never violence against civilians. At least that's what Mandela said. I'm sure there were instances where where that was not respected. So he's basically, I think, demonstrating what you might call sort of the pressure cooker theory, in the sense that if you if you suppress free speech, you might risk it blowing up in your face, and it becomes easier for those who are the targets of suppression to justify resorting to violence because all other avenues of resistant opposition are closed down. And the second speech is just before he's elected in the first free and multiracial election in South Africa, and he talks about the role of free speech, how important it was in dismantling apartheid, because human rights organizations around the world would shine a critical light of what was going on within South Africa. They would give a voice to those who were silenced within South Africa. And he gives a very good speech about the importance. He says that no one basically has a monopoly on the truth. And so he talks not only about the state, but he basically says that no organization, no institution has a monopoly in truth, and therefore any restriction on that should be avoided. So unfortunately, that's about it in terms of how I've included Africa. I think there's also, interestingly, that in the British colonies in West Africa, there was actually a time where there was a quite thriving press in the early 20th century. But as soon as sort of Pan-African ideas started spreading, then the British turned around and said, "Oh, we'll clamp down on it." So those are meager contributions in the book. I apologize. And one of the interesting things is, it might very well have been that there were fascinating cultures around the world that we simply don't know of, because we only have the scraps of history that have been passed down to us. I would think it's probably more likely than not that there were civilizations somewhere in the world that had some kind of institutionalized form of free speech. And you would probably also have different degrees of free speech in hunter-gatherer societies, where, of different degrees of openness to criticism, as you said, and coordinated social life among hunter-gatherers. I think the closest things that I've stumbled upon since to sort of seeing somewhere where you had possible free speech was the Wendat tribe of Native Americans, sort of part of the Iroquois Confederacy, who had a leader called Kandiaronk, who some anthropologists see as someone who really embodied proto-democratic ideals. The problem with that is that this is all inferred from a European history that uses a character supposedly based on Kandiaronk. And so I don't feel that the sources are strong enough, that it's a very appealing, intuitively, it would have been great to include. I just didn't feel that the sources were strong enough to really include it. What else? If I were to go to you, Robert, I think that you don't have to, I don't think there's one theory to rule them all when it comes to free expression, meaning that I think that there are several free speech theories or justifications that are, if not mutually reinforcing, then at least mutually complementary, and certainly not mutually exclusive. So democracy is obviously very important, but I also think that dignitarian justification for free speech are important. And so I don't think we have to choose just the one. And I think that the history of free speech, I think it's certainly the case that democracy, as you said, is unimaginable without free speech. But I think that freedom of conscience, for instance, is also an incredibly important driver. So there's a great quote that I use in the book from people who were living in Spain under the Inquisition, maybe in the 16th century or so. And these are not people who have been brought up with any elaborate free speech theories. They're probably very pious Catholics, but they find the the atmosphere imposed by the Inquisition so intolerable that they liken it to tyranny. So it's not that I don't think these people would be Democrats in any sense. They would probably be on board with all types of repression that we would find abhorrible today. But the fact that neighbors could go off to the Inquisition and say, oh, that person had something that was seemed to be proto-Jewish, or someone said something that did not live up to Catholic orthodoxy, maybe you should look into them. And so you couldn't have a free and open discussion, even among friends and families, was something that was found quite oppressive. And then I think you find the relationship between egalitarian and elitist free speech I think it's very interesting to see the arguments made around the Sedition Act, where the opponent or the proponents of the Sedition Act basically go back to sort of an almost Blackstonian concept of free speech. And a Virginian lawyer called George Hay, I think, sort of makes the case for sort of egalitarian free speech. But the flip side of that is that the British conception of free speech was one which did not recognize democracy in the way that we would understand it now. So if you were Tom Paine, even if you were in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, if you sold Tom Paine to the lower classes of British society in Britain, you would go to jail, and you would go to jail for a long time. Only the elites could be allowed to read it. So the idea that the lower classes should have a vote, should have an equal voice in society, was quite alien. And so that's a different conception of democracy, at least, to the one you highlighted. In terms of academic freedom, I would probably say that that academics' freedom is a subset of free speech. You said that there's viewpoint discrimination in the classroom, which I understand your example, but if you were to consistently grade someone lower on the basis that they were pro-Palestinians, for instance, and that they had specific political views in the classroom, that would not fly. That would certainly be seen as a violation of the speech rights of the students. So I get that there are restrictions, but that could also be said in different settings in the public sphere, so that there could be areas in public where you might have more restrictions on when you could protest, compared to other places. So I don't necessarily see the distinction between academic freedom and free speech as distinct as you may do. So I would prefer to see it as sort of a subset of larger free speech rights. Eugene, so I'm quite taken with New York Times versus Sullivan. I hope that Justice Thomas doesn't get his way. And it's a civil rights era case, of course, and I think it was a very important counterpunch to the well-honed tactic of southern states to basically sue reporters who came from the north and wrote about segregation and white supremacy, and threatened them, and then they would be awarded damages by all white juries in Alabama or Tennessee or wherever. And New York Times vs. Sullivan sort of is an attempt to stop that. And the interesting thing about New York Times vs. Sullivan is that it has actually been relied on by the Supreme Court, if I'm not mistaken, in Argentina, higher courts in Brazil, the ECOWAS court in Western Africa, in India, in a number of countries. New York Times vs. Sullivan has been relied on, cited by courts in cases where journalists and reporters are being targeted. So in Argentina, for instance, it was a journalist who was facing, I don't know if it was criminal defamation, I forget, basically for writing that a former president was corrupt, and I think there was good evidence that she was, and that person was acquitted, and the court cited New York Times versus Sullivan. So I think it's an important milestone, but I do think that civil libel has a role, and especially for if you take the Steele dossier. Donald Trump has to live with it, even though the veracity of it may not stand up to scrutiny. But if I was to walk down the streets of Nashville and film somebody, some random stranger, and then go back and tell my Twitters that this person is a rapist and has committed all kinds of crimes, and then I think it's fair for me to face the consequences of that. Criminal defamation, I think, is a big problem. In Italy, we recently had a case where a journalist was fined for criticizing the sitting president of Italy, which is pretty remarkable.
I'm loath to cut off the panel, but I do want to have some bottom-up speech in the room. So I might invite anyone who has a question to come down to these 2 microphones that we have here. And we'll take questions for the balance of our time, which is about 15 minutes. So please, that one I have not yet turned on. So if you would be so kind as to switch that one on, you can go ahead. Thank you so much.
Hello? Yeah. Hey. Can I go? So first of all, thank you, Jacob, for your exceptional book. I'm from Spain originally. And I grew up in a place where you could be killed for expressing their own ideas. My father was a police officer in the so-called Basque Country, one of the regions. I went to university seeing the same thing that we are seeing at Yale. I am appalled what is happening at Yale. So, and I was on the receiving end of those Hamas, in my view, are like the ETA members who were. So I grew up going all that. So very similar. I mean, it's applied Marxism. What they're doing is essentially weaponizing legitimate grievance to inject violence, speech, and threats and political violence into the campuses. And that is happening at Yale. It's happening at Columbia. Thankfully, we have been spared from that here, but it's appalling what I am seeing because it reminds me of where I saw growing up. So this whole of freedom of speech has been very important to me. So I think that you did an exceptional job. I want to just add 2 points and a question for Robert. So the 2 points is I agree with Julie. We are seeing the opposition of the main opponent of the president trying to be thrown to jail for political reasons in the United States. I think that the ban of TikTok is it's appalling. So we are seeing a decrease of free speech in the United States, even though I think that there is a still appeal to the Supreme Court and everything, and there is an election. But the fact that Biden has gone all the way to charge Trump with a bunch of made-up charges reminds me of what Franco used to do, and frankly, what I saw in Europe growing up. So that's appalling, and the same thing for. So for Robert, what's your take on what happened with Jay Bhattacharya, who was censored by so-called people here, and now that censor vote is about to be, there was a discussion, I think it was this week or last week.
What happened to
Jay
him?
Bhattacharya is the expert on public health, sorry, not Scott Atlas, I got it wrong. Scott Atlas, who is the expert on public health, who used to work for the Trump administration, where his academic freedom mixed with politics. He was, censored by the Stanford Senate. Now they're trying to take away the censor because they look like fools, essentially, the Stanford. So what's your take on that?
Just to be clear, he was censured.
Yeah.
So he was censored,
Gotcha.
and now this week, they're trying to take away the censor vote because they're looking like fools. And that's a good case that mixes the 2 things, academic freedom with freedom of speech in politics.
So, I mean, just to be crisp about the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech, if you're a young associate professor who's coming up for tenure in the astronomy department, if you write an article in the New York Times saying the moon is made of blue cheese, the state can't penalize you for that because that's your freedom of speech, but you cannot get tenure based on it, which is not a time, place, and manner. It's a content-based discrimination. They say you're incompetent as an astronomer. The point of a tenured professor, however, is that the colleagues do not condemn them for their academic views unless it shows, and they have the opportunity. There's a lot of due process issues with what happened at Stanford, but unless it can be shown that they're incompetent as a professor, which of course we can be. We don't have the freedom to be incompetent as professors, but we do have the freedom to have views which are different from the majority. And the case at Stanford was difficult because, first of all, there was no due process. Second, there wasn't a hearing that showed any connection to his competence as a medical person.
And Sweden was doing
And
that.
so it was inappropriate.
And Sweden was doing exactly what Scott Atlas was proposing, essentially.
His academic freedom was, I think, inhibited by that declaration. It was wrong for those reasons.
Hi, my name is Shafali Mangi, and I currently work for Meta. My question is, do you think that every country should have the same laws for freedom of speech, or do you think we should take factors into consideration, such as cultures and religion, where countries do identify with the religion? That can be for anyone.
Okay. I'll start. I don't think it would be possible or feasible to have the exact same laws around free speech everywhere in the world. You know, I've been very critical of Germany. I very often am, but I think it would be inconceivable. Like if you were the German chancellor and you were to go on TV tomorrow and say, "Hey, tomorrow it'll be okay to deny the Holocaust and you can fly the swastika." I mean, that's just. That might be 50 years down the line, but it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. Even though I think the German approach to hate speech is counterintuitive, and I think there can be all kinds of you know, reflections of history of why you would have different emphases on free speech around the world. So I mean, even in the U.S., you have in the States, you have, as Eugene pointed out, differences in laws. So I think that will probably be utopian to insist on the exact same protection of free speech everywhere. And it's also, you know, international human rights law does not build on the concept that all laws everywhere in the world should be the same. It builds on certain minimum standards that you have to live up to. So you can have different types of regulations, but they can't violate certain norms that we, at least on paper, agree on, even though they're often violated on a daily basis.
So I just wanted to chime in a bit about that. It's something I've thought a little about, not much. I'm not a comparativist. I do think that the reality of the world is if you do have democracies, they're going to be ruled primarily by their own voters, and they're going to have differences of opinion, and we shouldn't try to smooth all of that out entirely, whether with regard to speech, or with regard to religion, or with regard to sexual autonomy, or a variety of other things. This having been said, you know, I think the arguments for free speech work pretty well in lots of places, and the question I always ask of people who focus on Germany, let's say, in the German experiences, what would they say with regard to the Eastern European countries, some of which I believe have in fact prohibited communist parties because of their history with communism? And we can come up with all sorts of things, like imagine that the Estonian government not only prohibits a communist party because of the suffering the Estonians had under communism, but prohibits kind of praise of Russian nationalism, because that too has been a part of the Estonian story for more than just the 20th century. Estonia was, of course, part of the Russian Empire for quite a while. And they say, well, you know, we have our own personal experience, so we're going to throw someone in prison for talking about Russian nationalism because, you know, you don't know what it's like in America to live right next to Russia. It's hard. Or for example, the war, I hope, in Ukraine, land of my birth, and Russia, will be over at some point, and imagine the Ukrainian government says, okay, fine, you know, we're going to throw in prison anybody who defends Russian aggression in the past or argues in favor of union between Russia and Ukraine, or for that matter, speaks Russian, because that is part of kind of buying into the Putin project of kind of trying to build a greater Russia. I think at some point we'd say, you know, you've gone through a lot, and we feel really bad about it, and we know that we didn't go through that, so we understand that you feel that this is different, but some point, you know, if you're a democracy, you really have to be open to all sorts of ideas, even ones that may have caused you great grief in the past, because maybe some variant of them may make sense for the future. So that's the question I would ask. Would people take the same view with regard to East European countries, let's say, having, as I think some do, bans on advocacy of communism or bans on advocacy of Russian nationalism?
Thank you all for coming. I'm a student here at Stanford Law School. My name is George Muirhead. My question is for Professor Post. I enjoyed your distinction between, let's say, hierarchical free speech. There's some free speech coming from the top and some free speech flowing from the bottom. So to preface my question is on morality and how we are supposed to engage in that discussion in this quite polarized society as of today. So I suppose if we assume that distinction between which group should engage in this free speech, of the good, of morality, of where this society should go, which group if we're assuming that distinction, at the top of the hierarchy or at the bottom of the hierarchy would be most effective and or should engage in that discussion?
And or?
Should engage in that discussion.
So,
you might not even assume we should be engaging in that discussion.
so the first, I mean, that's a profound question. I mean, one way to think about this is just to think about speech in the abstract. When we say free speech, the implicit premise seems to be, well, more speech is always better. It should be free. Speech should be free to liberate itself. But actually, in our lives, all of us, none of us really do that. We speak in an appropriate way. We speak in the panel in a way to be convincing. You write a book to be persuasive. The only place I can think of where speech by itself is a good thing is maybe primal scream therapy, you know, when let it all out. But mostly we don't let it all out. And the good of the speech is the good of the practice that we're engaged in. And you were before saying one doesn't have to have one value to rule them all, which I quite agree with. But the issue here isn't the political. The issue is the public. Because public discussion is what defines what is political and not. The state takes its instruction from the speech of all of us. And that's precisely democratic. It's bottom up in exactly the way Jacob was defending it in his book. So when you say things like religion or morality, that's for all of us to think about with each other. And that's democratically bottom up. There isn't a knowledge of that the way there is a knowledge of whether the half-life of plutonium is so many years, right? And the best statement of that I know of is a philosopher named John Rawls. And he said, there are no experts in public opinion. You know, experts don't get 2 votes. We all get 1 vote. So the answer to your question is bottom up.
So if I may just follow up. So the bottom up should do it. Are they the most effective at engaging in that question?
Well, that's a different issue, you know, because being effective requires resources and money, and the bottom typically doesn't have money. If the bottom gets sufficiently enraged and there's enough of them, like en masse, then it's a different story, right? So effectiveness is a whole different sort of question that depends on many variables and is very contextual.
I'm surprised that I haven't heard the name Oliver Wendell Holmes come up in this, since I had thought that his 1919 dissenting opinion was a turning point in Americans' understanding of what free speech means. Is that not the case?
Yeah, so his a change of heart, and Robert will and Eugene will know more about it than I do. I mean, it would take a while before it sort of crystallized, but it's astonishing to sort of see the number of opinions that come out, and then suddenly the change of heart. So that's obviously an important an important moment in American free speech history. That, I mean, for me, I've never been that enamored with it. I kind of more like Madisonian ideals of free speech. That I think his report of 1800 on the Sedition Act, for instance, packs a lot more punch. Resonates better also with this sort of egalitarian, elitist conception, and is a more robust, time-tested conception of free speech, which actually also acknowledges the dangers of disinformation, abuses of free speech, but warns about the consequences of legislating against it. But I don't know if others have opinions on the great Holmes. And of course, I only mentioned Frederick Douglass once, but his entire life is basically dedicated to the exercise of free speech. It's probably maybe one of the most prolific and effective practitioners of parousia in the history of our species, and also had very clear idea of what free speech is and why it's important as a universal human right for everyone.
Do we have time for, I think I can decide that we do have time for one more question from the guy with the tie. And this is mostly for Jacob, but maybe for the others as well. The subtitle of the book brings the story up to social media, and social media, it's arguable that social media companies are today the most significant regulators of what you can and cannot say to the public, much more so than governments. And my question, especially to Jacob, is how close should free speech principles that grew up applicable to government be to social media practices about freedom of speech?
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, Michael. Well, traditional social media is a bit like the Walkman now, right? With generative AI. I mean, it's the whole game is changing, and it's changing at such a pace that, I think many of the discussions we had around social media will look very quaint in 5 years or 10 years or 1 year or 6 months. So I would say ideally in a more sort of decentralized ecosystem of social media, it should, they should set their own rules, but when you have platforms with billions of people, and some of them operate in countries where social media is maybe the only way to challenge official censorship and propaganda, it becomes important that social media companies try to emulate free speech policies. And most of them, all of them, sort of all of the big ones say that they live up to international human rights principles. They don't. It's probably impossible to do it consistently at scale, but their policy, even their policy, if you take something like hate speech, they quite clearly do not follow that faithfully. And there are all kinds of good reasons why they don't do so, because for every time someone like me criticizes a social media company for having too strict content moderation rules, there'll be 10,000 others who criticize them for being too lax and saying that they have to crack down on this speech or that speech. And also, Elon Musk is a good example, someone who came in, hey, I'm all about free speech. It took around 5 minutes before he started cracking down on people who had the wrong ideas, and before he came up with sort of elaborate free speech theories that, excluded kinds of speech that he didn't find convenient to have on his own platform. So I think it's impossible to have it, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to have that as the guiding star. But ideally, I would, I think having more agency for users is maybe a more productive way to go to go forward, so that users themselves have more input on over what kind of content they want to be confronted with.
Jacob, you know this far better than I, but would you say that international human rights law tolerates or on the whole regulates hate speech as distinct from the First Amendment to the U.S.
Oh yeah, very much. I mean, so Article 20, paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights actually mandates that that certain kinds of hate speech be prohibited. It's been interpreted by the great David Kay, a U.S. free speech expert from the University of California, in a very speech protective manner, but there's no guarantee that this will continue to be the case. And the sadness of that provision in international human rights law is that it's basically the brainchild of the communist states, starting with going back to Stalin's Soviet Union, and there was pretty robust opposition to that provision among Western democracies, many of them who have since sort of come around to that logic. A final anecdote about that, and there's also another international human rights convention which mandates the criminalization of racist hate speech, which is the Covenant on the Elimination of All Racial Discrimination. And the backstory to that is fascinating because it came about because of the so-called swastika epidemic. So that happened in 1959 on Christmas Day in Cologne. A synagogue was defaced by swastikas, and then it became an epidemic that spread all over the world, including a Jewish cemetery that was vandalized in Staten Island, all over the world. And that led to an outcry, and it embarrassed Germany, which adopted a hate speech law in 1960, sort of gave the impetus of this convention. What has been unearthed since then is that the swastika epidemic was instigated by the KGB, which, as a disinformation campaign to blacken the reputation of Western Germany and Western states. So it's interesting that a disinformation campaign became the impetus behind a hate speech ban in international human rights law. But that's why the history is fascinating.
So Jacob, I'm sorry, Julie, after you.
No, I just wanted to agree on what you were saying, and maybe going back to some elements you were sharing earlier. I think actually, and going back to your book, I think actually maybe the very fact that we are discussing publicly about the role of social media companies, technology companies in general, because the same debates are happening more or less right now with generative AI. The very fact that we're discussing their role as arbiters of truth, arbiters of speech, is important, and probably is one historical occasion to move away from the weaponization of speech that you refer to in the introduction of your speech and throughout your book, in the sense that it's not only, speech will probably not only be concentrated in the hands of, in this case, billionaires. Before it was kings, now it's billionaires. But instead, maybe we will see a time where we can have public conversation and setting probably rules that everyone can agree on. So that's probably the optimistic side of things.
And I'm afraid that's going to have to be the final word.
No. Perfectly fine.
There's freedom of speech, but there's also freedom to let the audience go somewhere close to the end of the announced end of time. So two announcements. One is that following, as soon as we break up here, there is a reception down the hallway that way in the last. If you go, you'll be out on an open second floor breezeway. It's the last room on the right. Room 270 is the reception to which everyone is welcome, and this will give us a chance to continue these conversations. And lucky people will find out what Eugene would have said if we hadn't ended. The second is to announce our next event, which is our annual conference. And this will be basically a day and a half, a Friday afternoon, and all day Saturday, May 17th to 18th. And we couldn't think of anything timely to do for this year, so we went with the topic of, it's called Presidents Beware, Investigations, Impeachment, Disqualification, and Prosecution. So it's an all-star cast of speakers from leading schools, plus prosecutors, defense attorneys, and other, a few non-academic voices, and I think it promises to be a most illuminating conversation. So you're all welcome. Please do register on the website in advance. And with that, I'd just like to thank especially Jacob for his wonderful book and his willingness to come and talk with us tonight, and also to his interlocutors tonight. So please join me in thanking him.